Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 99, now with Chocolate Flake. Today's questions are of course taken from Guide 168, that's the Lord Clive class monitors, and a short history of ship's cats, plus of course the Patreon questions at the end. So let's get on with the questions today. Dr. Gull 1888 asks, could you shed some light on the Haldane mission prior to World War I, especially any details on Lord Haldane's ideas or suggestions for limiting Germany's naval armament? The Haldane mission was an attempt to forestall both the naval arms race and the rising tensions between Germany and the British Empire. Effectively, Britain didn't actually want to get involved in a massive war with a large European power, if it could avoid it, and the Haldane mission was an attempt to do so. It was sent out with 3 points that were drafted by the British government. The first point was fundamentally that naval superiority was absolutely key to Great Britain as a nation, not so much to Germany, and therefore the German naval programme, which was quite clearly aimed at the Royal Navy, needed to be at the minimum capped at the current rate of building, and if possible reduced, and the Navy then obviously becoming smaller relative to the Royal Navy, which could continue its build-up efforts to get back to the two-power standard it had once enjoyed. Secondly, the British offered as kind of the olive branch to try and get the first concession out of the Germans, assistance with German colonial ambitions in Africa, which up until this point the UK had been ambivalent or actively against. And thirdly, there was a proposal for both sides to agree that they should not deliberately engage in aggressive action against the other, i.e. they wouldn't proactively declare war against the other party or declare war in such a manner that was guaranteed to bring the other party into the conflict. Unfortunately, these negotiations foundered, as you might expect, given the fact we had the First World War a couple of years later, and they were undermined from the start pretty much by the fact that the Kaiser chose the day before the Haldane mission arrived in Germany to announce that he wanted to pass a new naval bill which would expand the German Navy even further. So the negotiations started under the cloud of the Kaiser having effectively already stuck two fingers up at the primary British aim, which was to reduce the German naval build-up. The other major problem that they ran into in terms of trying to come up with some kind of agreement was that whilst the Germans certainly were relatively keen on being able to expand their African holdings, they also wanted a very specific agreement with the British that basically amounted to, as long as we can't technically be accused of being the aggressor in a conflict, Great Britain shouldn't get involved in any war that Germany gets involved in. And this was all part of Germany's plan to try and gain dominance over the European continent, because with the various network of alliances that were set up, as would later become evident in World War I, there were all sorts of ways to legalistically tangle yourself up so that you could declare war on people without, on paper, seeming to be the aggressor. So obviously in World War I, it all cascaded out of Austria giving an ultimatum to Serbia, Austria deciding to attack Serbia, Russia then threatening to attack Austria, and then Germany ostensibly coming to the defence of its friend Austria against the hostilities of Russia by attacking France. And that's just the short version of it, before we get into everybody else getting stuck in. But you can see the danger here. Under the treaty proposal that the Germans had put forward, technically speaking, Britain would be breaking a treaty because Germany was, by the letter of the law, reacting to in the defence of an ally and not simply just arbitrarily declaring war. Plus, the Kaiser was exceptionally proud of his fleet and really didn't see any point in reducing it. So, unfortunately, the Haldane mission failed. Michael Hammond asks, are there any historical examples of navies destroying enemy lighthouses in order to disrupt their shipping? There are a number of examples of lighthouses being destroyed in conflicts, especially in kind of civil war type conflicts, or at least being badly damaged. They tend to be fairly strong and so quite difficult to actually completely level. However, almost all examples of lighthouses being destroyed are usually done by an armed forces branch that isn't a navy. So in the case of civil wars, it's quite often done by the armies, possibly on both sides, usually more on one than the other. A number of lighthouses in the USA were destroyed in this manner or badly damaged in the American Civil War. But generally speaking, yeah, it's either the army or, in the case of places like the Second World War, the air forces. So the Luftwaffe sunk a number of light ships and badly damaged others, and did bomb one or two lighthouses, even though attacking lighthouses by that point was against the actual codified rules of war. And so the reason navies tended to avoid it was two reasons. Well, two primary reasons and a tertiary reason that's somewhat less important than the first two. The two primary ones are that by the time anyone bothered to codify rules of war, lighthouses went on the list of do not attack pretty much immediately. And so it would be a rather pointless war crime to commit. The second reason is related to why they went on the list of do not attack targets very quickly, and that is that lighthouses are completely non-discriminatory as to who they alert to what's going on in terms of danger and coastlines and hidden rocks and such. And so pretty much everybody recognised that everyone benefits equally from lighthouses, both the enemy ships that might be present within range, the hostile ships, presumably whose shore it is, but also neutral shipping. And that's a fairly important point, because effectively blowing up an enemy lighthouse, yes, it might disrupt their shipping, but it's very likely to disrupt neutral shipping and lead to neutral shipping losses, because there may be ships from neutral powers that are trading with that nation, there may be ships from neutral powers that are trading with other nations, possibly even your own, who are passing by your enemy and need to be able to navigate safely. So destroying a lighthouse would generally put lots and lots of people at risk, which was viewed as an immoral act anyway, and on a very practical level would be potentially likely to either bring sanction or from neutral countries, or possibly even those neutral countries joining the war against you because you're posing a hazard to their shipping as well. So those two factors, they're kind of interlinked, but it basically meant that navies, by and large, generally left lighthouses alone. Although, of course, there are a few exceptions to this. But the tertiary reason that I mentioned is that, well, for the largest majority of the time, and certainly all the time period that we're covering on this channel, with the exception of the odd carrier strike in World War II, in order to destroy a lighthouse, you have to be pretty darn close to it, because you've got to be within gun range. And if you're within gun range of a lighthouse, it also means you're in pretty close range to the dangerous shore or rocks that the lighthouse is warning you against. And as we said, lighthouses tend to be pretty strongly built, so they're relatively difficult to destroy even with naval artillery. They're also tall and thin, so they're not the easiest of targets, even though they don't tend to move. And you're also going to be incredibly near the enemy's coast, which opens you up for counterattack by enemy shipping. So they're not the easiest of targets in the first place, and certainly not something that the average captain would relish going after, considering that you'd be putting your own ship or ships at huge risk of enemy counterattack or being driven ashore by the weather in earlier periods, all to accomplish a goal that would probably have a fairly large net negative outcome for your nation if you succeeded, and to be honest, maybe even if you only succeeded in damaging it. James Simmons asks, the US Navy had compressed air-powered dynamite launching guns as shore defence weapons in the late 1800s, early 1900s, prior to the invention of reliable high-explosive rounds. Were they used by other countries, and were they, or would they, have been effective? So the pneumatic cannon, or sometimes called the dynamite gun, and yes, this is exactly the same kind of weapon that was fitted in USS Vesuvius, was something of a flash in the pan, a little bit of a passing trend. It had a number of technical issues which also mitigated against its use, but they might have been able to solve them with longer development times. But the main reason they came about was they existed in a very, very narrow window between the invention of high explosives, which were very attractive for use in shooting at people, and the development of stable high explosives. The difference being that if you stick a shell full of dynamite into a conventional gun with a powder charge and fire it, what you're probably going to do is invent a very expensive pipe bomb, because the dynamite will get set off by the detonation of the charge. Either that or the shock of the acceleration. And so people were looking for alternative ways to accelerate large packages of this brand new high explosive, and using a pneumatic compressed air system was pretty much seen as the way to go, very briefly. Everything fell by the wayside because in relatively short order they developed, as I mentioned, stable high explosives that could withstand the shock of acceleration, and thus the warheads on armor-piercing and high-explosive shells moved on to that, and the dynamite gun or the pneumatic cannon fell by the wayside. The gun itself was invented in the US, and so the US Navy and coastal defences kind of got first crack at adopting them, and because of this very short time window in which they were actually viable weapons, they really only got into any kind of major service in the US. Beyond that, other countries that may or may not have been interested in them by the time they got around to having a look at it and making some evaluations, the more stable high explosive rounds had already been produced, so they could go back to producing normal conventional artillery. There was one last hurrah for the pneumatic cannon, however, which was in World War II, when a version was developed as a cheap and easy method that could be powered by either compressed air or steam, as a kind of low-altitude last-ditch anti-aircraft weapon that could be cheaply and easily mass-produced for merchant ships and trawlers. And I strongly suggest if you're interested in weird and wonderful weaponry, then that's probably one to look up. However, the second part of your question, were they or would they have been effective? In terms of would they have been effective, it depends on the era that they may or may not have been called into use for. The one problem, well, the biggest problem with these weapons was, relatively speaking, short range. Now, in an era when you couldn't really hit much beyond 1,000 or so yards anyway, i.e. the late 1800s, this was not so much of a problem. However, by the early to mid 1900s, naval gun engagement ranges had increased dramatically, and you wouldn't be able to effectively use these weapons at that point because they just wouldn't reach out as far. In terms of that very narrow window where gun engagement ranges were such that they could possibly have been shot back at attacking vessels, whether or not they would have been effective, I mean, the charge that they carried, when you look at the effect that Vesuvius's guns had in shore bombardment, the charge was huge. So that would have certainly had some rather interesting effects on anything it had hit. Obviously, it's not going to be an armor-piercing round, but there's a lot of superstructure and secondary weapons that could be destroyed outside of armor belts, and obviously, especially with the older ships that are somewhat smaller and covered in paint, fire is also a huge risk. The one thing that I would have reservations about using these weapons, even in the sort of a late 1800s coastal defense scenario, is what Vesuvius found when it was shelling Spanish positions in Cuba, and actually what Theodore Roosevelt found whilst he was using some field artillery-based versions in other parts of the war, and that is that they're very technically complex weapons, and getting the pressure exactly right for the overall ambient air temperature, pressure, humidity, etc. conditions is much, much harder, at least with the technology of the time, as compared to existing artillery powder charges. And so reliability is a problem, and getting the range right is a problem, because you can charge up the pressure to a certain number of psi, launch your projectile, and you can do what appears to be exactly the same thing for your next round, and the projectile might go in completely different range, which is a bit of a problem. So with enough of them and enough practice and enough refinement, you'd probably hit something, and that something would feel that very, very painfully. But I rather suspect you'd be better off with a similar battery of conventional coastal defense artillery in sort of the overall. And Imperium Americanum asks, you say that ships' cats have been supposedly banned on hygienic grounds. Do you think this policy and its justification are a bunch of nonsense, or do you see sense in it? So, yeah, broadly, I do think it is a bit of an overreaction to ban ships' cats from being aboard. I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, ships' cats were around for thousands of years, and nobody ever reported a ship's crew dying of the deadly cat flu or something like that. So I don't think the hygienic issues are really all that valid. I mean, yes, okay, cats can leave a mess, but you can train them. And yes, cats can have fleas, but to be honest, a ship's cat that's spending months and months away, potentially from land, is probably one of the least likely of all creatures to end up with a lasting infestation of fleas, especially given that obviously treatment options and such are available these days. And, I mean, even on safety grounds, there was plenty of moving heavy machinery and such like aboard ships in the First and Second World Wars, and cats seemed to be remarkably adept at not getting crushed by large moving gears and such. So that, I don't think, is valid either. About the only real quote-unquote justification I can see for banning cats aboard warships is that these days warships have an awful lot more sensitive electronic equipment, data cables, etc. And anyone who's owned a particularly mischievous cat will probably be able to verify the fact that cats really like chewing on things, and one of their favoured things to chew on is power cables, whether that's your laptop power charger, your phone's USB charging cable, or whatever. These kinds of nice, long, stringy, tough things always end up in their mouths, and given that aboard a warship you're not going to have everything tucked away behind panelling nice and neatly all the time because, well, you need to access it for maintenance and repairs, there is probably a reasonable risk of a cat chewing through something particularly vital and expensive, which, yeah, okay, I can see the argument there, but at the same time you can just armour or duct your cables. It's not the world's most difficult thing, but yeah, there's a small argument in the case of damage to expensive electronics that could be made for not having cats aboard, but there are counters to it, and I think that if they were going to say the genuine reasons for not having cats aboard, it would be much more honest to say that than just go, oh, somehow from the 1970s humans have become completely unable to deal with the hygiene issues of having a cat on board a ship, despite the fact that we've managed to deal with them for the past few millennia. Clearly we are all weak and pathetic now compared to our glorious ancestors, for the mighty cat has the power to overwhelm the crew of several tens of thousands of tons worth of warship. And I suppose maybe with US aircraft carriers and ships of that kind of size, there's an argument the cat might get lost and no one would know where it's gone, which could be a bit of a problem. Dejan Gabrovsek, I think, apologies if I mispronounced that, asks, how often was the naval gun itself good, but its mounting was bad or inadequate? So, yeah, this is quite the problem. I mean, you mentioned in your question the 5.25 inch as mounted on the King George V's, the 16 inch as mounted on the Nelsons, and those are two very good examples. The 5.25, to a large extent, I mean, not entirely, but a lot of its problems were to do with the fact that the almost cylindrical mountings on the King George V just didn't have enough room. The Nelson's turrets, again, most of their problems came from taking a design that had been intended for a G3 battlecruiser that was several thousand tons heavier and trimming things down as much as possible in order to lighten the weight, and it turns out they'd actually trimmed a bit too much. Yeah, bad mountings or mountings that are inadequate for service, the issues are everywhere. I mean, let's go over a few others. The 4.7-inch mounting, especially the twin mount, as you would find on something like a tribal class. Now, okay, fair enough, they weren't anticipating the need for high-angle gunnery at the time, but the mounting itself, outside of some very interesting, shall we say, unauthorized modifications, proved incredibly difficult to adapt for high-angle firing. There was nothing wrong with the gun itself. I mean, it had a fair bit of recoil, but it was a long barrel gun, so what do you expect? But yeah, adapting the mounting was quite hard. Some of the US gun mounts, I mean, for example, the 16-inch 50 gun mount that was designed for the Iowa was completely wholly inadequate, and they had to get an entire new gun to fit it because it was too small. On a number of US ships, on a number of US standards, the main gun mountings, again, were pretty poor in terms of their usability in service. So there was nothing particularly wrong with the 14-inch guns themselves, but quite often the mountings were built with the guns just too close, and they got interference patterns that ruined the accuracy, and then they had to modify them with delay coils and the like in order to actually hit something a little bit smaller than a small country. Again, once it's corrected, the gun was fine. There was nothing wrong with the gun design itself. And a lot of this comes down to, well, two factors. One is that gun designers tend to be a lot more careful when it comes to designing their weapon, because the consequences of a badly designed gun will quite often be fatal, whereas the consequences of a badly designed mounting are more annoying and only really become fatal as a secondary effect of not being able to utilise the gun properly. The King George V's 14-inch guns as well, for example, are another case. That the gun itself was actually pretty decent. The turret and all the associated features with it, however, not so much until they fixed them. And you could go on in almost any navy. I mean, a lot of Italian 8-inch guns, I mean, we're not going to talk about the big ones because that's more of an ammunition control issue, but a lot of the Italian 8-inch guns on a number of their cruisers, again, guns themselves absolutely great. Mountings put the guns too close together. You see this also on some of the early US heavy cruisers like the Pensacola's and the Northamptons. And with the Japanese, for example, the theoretically dual-purpose guns they stuck on the Fubukis and subsequent destroyers, again, the gun itself was passable as a dual-purpose weapon in terms of its rate of fire and throw weight of shell. I mean, it's not going to necessarily hold a candle to a 5-inch 38, but very little can. But the mounting that meant that it was too slow to train and elevate to be a practical dual-purpose weapon, and so on and so forth. So yeah, a lot of the time when you see either primary or secondary guns being derided as inadequate or bad, it's very, very rare that the gun itself is actually bad. It's almost always the case of the mounting being an issue in some way, shape or form, to the point that actually when you get a really good gun and a good gun mounting to go with it, it's time to break out the champagne, the rum and the whiskey and celebrate, because well, your ship's maintenance parties are going to absolutely love you. And this is why you see certain types of gun proliferate everywhere. So in the US's case, the 5-inch 38, or the British 4.5-inch, or indeed the 40mm Bofors, they tend to proliferate everywhere once someone realises that, hey, this gun and mount combination actually works really well. Daniel Schwerwater, again I think, asks, how do you think the naval part of the war in the Mediterranean Sea would have gone if Italy had joined the Central Powers instead of the Entente? To be perfectly honest, I think the single biggest impact of Italy joining the Central Powers would be more likely to be on land, because you won't have the sort of the Alpine War between the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians, and you also won't have a rather embattled France with a safe southeastern flank. Instead, it's going to be the Austro-Hungarians are going to have a lot more forces to throw east at the Russians, and, well, south as well, technically. And the Italians, of course, would then, in theory, be pushing into southern France, which would stretch the French army further. But that's a land-based war, so I'll leave that for somebody who's better versed in the land conflict to elucidate on the possibilities of. In terms of the naval aspect, it's very interesting, actually, because even if they're on the same side, realistically speaking, the chances of Austria-Hungary and Italy working together successfully for any prolonged period are actually relatively slim. There's an awful lot of bad blood there. We could hypothesize that they would do so, but there is also the fact that the Tegethoff class, as built, were not necessarily the best suited for long-distance cruising and other similar operations, so whether they would have been of massive use outside of the immediate environs of the Austro-Hungarian coastal holdings is questionable. You might have got better use out of the pre-dreadnoughts, to be honest. Assuming that Italy joins in 1914, the French Navy committed most of its strength to the Mediterranean anyway. Now, historically, obviously, that was used moving troops back and forth from North Africa and to help the Italians lock the Austro-Hungarians in. In this scenario, the Marine Nationale is going to have to focus a lot more on bottling up the Italians and probably fighting them. The Royal Navy has obviously pulled most of its strength back to the North Sea, but they do still have some relatively significant force elements in the Mediterranean, especially with older vessels. So, yeah, there would be quite a large number of ships staring off of each other. The combination of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean forces and the Marine Nationale would theoretically have a numerical advantage, especially in the older sort of armoured cruiser pre-dreadnought battleship paradigm, and in that respect, especially in a sort of close quarters fight in the Adriatic, the Dantons would actually probably prove quite impactful. However, the Royal Navy is unlikely to spare many, if any, dreadnoughts for the theatre anytime soon. It's going to mean operations against the Ottomans are going to be massively curtailed, if not stopped entirely. And yeah, the Corbeils are not exactly the world's best dreadnoughts. I certainly wouldn't put money on a Corbeil taking on something like Dante Alighieri. I'd definitely be putting my money on the Italians there. And between the Italian dreadnoughts that are under construction and the somewhat questionable value of the Tegethoffs, there would certainly be a significant numerical dreadnought advantage very quickly for the Austro-Hungarian and Italian fleets, even if their cooperation is very loose. It would be interesting, because we might either see a fight of a few allied French dreadnoughts and a large number of French semi and pre-dreadnoughts alongside British semi and pre-dreadnoughts, versus a Central Powers fleet that's heavier on the dreadnoughts but lighter on the older ships, which would actually be a really, really interesting fight to see, to determine just exactly how far superior a dreadnought is over a pre-dreadnought when numbers are against them. But it might also force the British to detach units of their own dreadnoughts fairly quickly. Now, fair enough, with the German threat being what it is, they might send older vessels, such as Dreadnought herself and the Bellerophons, or they might send sort of the oddballs, things like Agincourt, Erin, and Canada in. It's difficult to tell, but it would have a huge impact on the general naval consensus in the Mediterranean, but B, the battles that might result would probably actually be some of the most interesting naval battles in history, to be perfectly honest. Lucid Nonsense asks, were the World War I monitors ever engaged by torpedo boats or U-boats, and what was the outcome? Yes, they were, and in every case the torpedo bulgers proved highly effective, although in one particular case this was not such a good thing as you might imagine. The incidents were associated with the monitors Erebus and Terror, Terror of course being shown here, as well as 2 out of 4 Edgar-class protected cruisers, which had been refitted with massive bulgers and were being used as for shore bombardment as well. Now, in all 4 of those cases, they were hit by torpedoes. In Terror's case, 3 torpedoes, and the bulgers protected the ships and kept them afloat, so they didn't sink. So, yeah, that was a good outcome for them. However, there was also HMS Glatten, which was formerly a Norwegian coastal defence ship, was taken into Royal Navy service alongside HMS Gorgon, and when it caught fire and there was a risk of the magazine detonating and possibly setting off a ammunition ship nearby, well, obviously everyone got off the ship relatively quickly, but to try and make sure that the ammunition ship didn't go up like a massive firework, they decided to sink it via torpedo, which was pretty much like the only remote scuttling thing that was available for them at the time. So they launched a spread of torpedoes into it, and the bulge did its job too well. The thing stubbornly remained afloat and on fire. So eventually they had to wheel out some other torpedoes, and then, fortunately, because it was static, they could launch torpedoes very precisely into the holes blasted by the first torpedoes, and that eventually put the thing under. And thus the port it was in did not disappear in a towering column of fire and brimstone. Coltax 100 asks, what if the British built 1 N3 instead of 2 Nelsons? Would it have been better than 2 Nelsons? In a one-on-one ship duel, yeah, sure. In a practical and strategic sense, almost certainly not, because if the British somehow finagle a Washington Treaty into allowing them to build a single N3 instead of 2 Nelsons, you can absolutely guarantee that the other naval powers are going to say, okay, 1 and 1 only. And Britain's probably going to get its allocation of battleships cut down to 14 instead of 15 as a result. I mean, obviously, realistically, they were never going to let that happen, but let's assume, for the sake of argument, that that does occur. Now, although you now have an immensely powerful and incredibly difficult to kill battleship on hand, which might seem to be brilliant, and indeed, well, if you thought Rodney versus Bismarck was bad, wait until you see N3 versus Bismarck, but the reason it would have probably actually been a net negative for the Royal Navy is, one, it would almost certainly have meant the Royal Navy has 1 less battleship around, and it needs battleship hulls all over the place. So if you look at the early war, you can see Nelson and Rodney are doing 2 very different jobs in 2 very different places. They can't physically be, like, this battleship cannot physically be in 2 places at once. Yeah, if it was a G3 battlecruiser, you might be able to make some argument that with it being much faster, it can be in more places, and would definitely be a lot more useful as a front-line unit compared to the slower N3. But even so, even a G3 can't physically be in 2 separate theatres of operations at once. Although its existence might have allowed Hood to get its refit, but never mind, we're talking about the N3 here. The other big problem with the N3 is that if you've got a N3-sized vessel with its 18-inch gun armament, its stupidly thick belt, and its massive displacement in the 1920s, that means that as the naval treaty system starts to break down in the 1930s, that is going to be the baseline against which people who want to fight the UK are going to be building their ships. So we said, sort of, yeah, Rodney versus Bismarck or N3 versus Bismarck, but if the N3 existed, it almost certainly wouldn't be N3 versus Bismarck as we understand it, because Hitler would have pretty much had to build a ship that was at least hopefully capable of countering the N3. Now, getting a ship to be faster than the N3 is not exactly a difficult proposition, but getting a ship that can hope to outfight an N3 in a direct confrontation is an entirely different ballgame. And the thing is, even if let's say, for sake of argument, even if the Nazi technology advancement wasn't quick enough to allow them to build a ship that could completely counter an N3, the fact that they'd have to try would mean that whatever they come out with, and probably eventually called Bismarck anyway, would be a lot bigger, a lot tougher, and a lot more heavily armed than the historical Bismarck was, which would mean that any other Royal Navy combatant other than an N3, or rather the N3, would have had a lot more problems dealing with it. Now, obviously, that's going to have all sorts of other secondary order effects in that it's very unlikely the British would have pressed for the King George V's with their 14-inch guns. You almost certainly would have seen kind of an early version of a Lion class, at least, to try and keep up. But yeah, if the Japanese built the Yamato thinking they were going to fight Treaty era and World War I era battleships, imagine what the Japanese would have tried to build if they were trying to build a capital unit that they knew might have to face off against something like this. It would have put the rest of the Royal Navy's capital ship fleet in severe danger just because of what everyone else would have done as a reaction to this individual vessel. So therefore, yeah, overall, strategically speaking, one N3 instead of two Nelsons, not a good trade. Bay Reese asks, could the US Navy recommission the Iowa-class battleships if they wanted to? This really falls into two categories. There's a practical answer and a technical answer. The practical answer is no. They really aren't going to be able to anytime soon, or really ever. The technical answer is yes, theoretically it's possible if you want to throw stupid amounts of money at it. There are some rather obvious issues, like the fact that Iowa would need a fair bit of work to the second main turret, the superfiring 16-inch turret, which was never really fully repaired after the accident in the early 90s. But I mean, by and large, you'd be looking at, similar to the 1980s, you'd need a complete electronic systems refit. Again, because what was current in the 80s and early 90s is definitely not current now. You're going to have issues with general hull fatigue, which is going to be probably a much larger problem. And that, to be honest, is going to depend on exactly where the ships are stored, because the water conditions in Hawaii, in California, in Virginia, and in Pennsylvania are going to be, or New Jersey, flipping it, although I'm going to get stabbed otherwise, are going to be very different, and the weather conditions as well. So exactly what state each ship's hull is going to be in is going to vary. And I mean, with them being turned into museum ships, some elements of them obviously will have been deconverted from military spec. Some items may have been shipped off or taken off elsewhere. You'd have to get those back. It's not an impossible task. And again, you could stick them in dry dock to do any necessary hull refits. The big elephant in the room, which I'm getting around to, is the engines. They're pretty much shot, unfortunately. Battleships in general, when you look at the ones that aren't taken out of service due to other factors like treaties, generally, after about 2 decades, give or take, of service use, they tend to need complete engine refits. So this is why you see an awful lot of modernisation and refit of World War I era capital ships in the 1930s, because in a lot of the time their engines are basically done. And HMS Hood is another good example. By 4041, she's been in service without a major engine refit or replacement since pretty much commissioning in the late teens, early 20s, and her engines are basically on the last legs. So with the Iowas, they were obviously commissioned in the latter part of World War II, so we're talking about mid-1940s. They're in service for just around about half a decade, again, plus or minus a bit, given on the specific ship, before they sort of step down a little bit. Then they're back in for the Korean War. then they're back into reserve, then they're back out for the Vietnam War, and then they're back into reserve. And that all told probably accounts for 10 to 15 years of engine wear. Then they're obviously all brought back in the 80s, and they stay in service for 10 to 15 years again, which means that, yeah, effectively their engines are pretty much done. They've lasted an awful lot longer than obviously most battleships, but their actual in-service lives, while the engines are ticking over, the engines are pretty much reached end of life. So you would have to refit and basically replace the engines, boilers, etc. And that's an absolutely colossal task. If you look at some of the 1930s refits, you're effectively taking the ship down you're almost dismantling most of the ship, to be honest. Or large parts of it. And you'd have to do that. You would have to find a completely new set of propulsion. And this is going to be doubly hard in the Iowa's case because, of course, massive steam turbine propulsion systems aren't really in vogue with the Navy anymore. It's all gas turbines or diesels or nuclear power, depending on your Navy and size of ship in question, which would mean a lot more than just at the already massive task of refitting the engines. You'd have to rip out effectively the entire propulsion system except for the propellers and shafts and replace it with something entirely new, then rejig the rest of the ship to cope with the fact it's no longer got this massive steam generation plant tucked underneath it. So, yeah, if you had, the amount of money it would cost to completely redo the Iowa's power plants and update it all, you'd probably find it's actually cheaper just to build a modern version of the Iowa, to be perfectly honest. It might look almost identical outside, but internally would be a completely brand new ship. That's probably actually going to be cheaper than bringing the Iowas back into service at this point from scratch. And now for some Patreon questions. Mason asks, why did only Britain, Japan and Germany have battlecruisers in World War I? So he goes on to ask specifically about Italy, the United States and France. So the answer basically comes down to role and finances available. So you look at the chain that develops. So Britain builds battle cruisers because Admiral Fisher wants something that can sweep up enemy cruisers. And the reason it wants to sweep up enemy cruisers very quickly instead of relying on Britain's own cruiser fleet is because most of that cruiser fleet has had to be recalled to the home country to basically deter hopefully the Germans. So Britain has a need for it. Initially, nobody else does because nobody else is going to be in a position to sweep the seas of enemy cruisers. Certainly not on this kind of scale and speed that would require a battle cruiser. The Germans build battle cruisers because the British have battle cruisers, and if the British have battle cruisers, then, well, they're going to work perfectly well against the Germans' fleet screening cruisers just as much as they would against any commerce raising cruisers, and so the Germans need to counter them. So now you've got two powers. The Japanese want battle cruisers because, to be perfectly honest, their main threat is, at that point, the United States. And the United States, believe it or not, actually has a number of cruisers that they're slightly worried about, things like the Tennessee class. And so they want to be able to clear up American cruisers and destroy the American fleet screen. Plus, when it comes to the Japanese specifically, they have a lot of relatively recent combat experience with fighting against the Chinese and fighting against the Russians that at least is suggesting to them that the armoured cruiser actually has some kind of role in the battle line alongside the battleship. And of course, now the modern version of the armoured cruiser is the battle cruiser. They're kind of going for that mix of battleship and battle cruiser. When it comes to Italy, France, and the United States, in short, it comes down to funding and timing. The French by the time of World War One, bear in mind, are still struggling to get the Corbett's fully into service and are just about managing to bring in the Britannias, which are their first and second dreadnought classes. They're well behind their previous major power rivals, such as Britain and Germany, and to divert resources to a battlecruiser, it's just not viable for them at that point. They need more battleships. Now, fair enough, they do have a sort of battlecruiser version of the Normandy under general consideration at the start of World War One, but it doesn't really go anywhere because of World War One. So yeah, France basically is trying to catch up in battleship numbers, let alone anything else. Italy is doing its best, but in terms of overall ship numbers, it's even further behind than the French are, and so for similar reasons, they need to focus on their battle fleet first and foremost. Within the scope of the Mediterranean, their existing cruisers and their now dreadnoughts can pretty much track down and hunt anything. I mean, yes, the Mediterranean is a very active environment generally, but it's actually relatively small, and that means an overall speed advantage is less of an advantage because you can string out a line of searching ships in the Mediterranean and actually have a reasonable chance of catching something, and you can kind of drive the enemy over to their ports and sit off of there much more easily than trying to hunt down random cruisers floating around something particularly large like the Atlantic or the Pacific. And when it comes to the United States, they would have dearly loved battlecruisers. They had a number of battlecruiser designs on the drawing board all the way through up to and including World War One. Some of them pretty innovative, some of them quite clearly the result of some fairly quick thinking, one of them being effectively a Wyoming class where they just take off 2 turrets and substitute engines. Small changes to the hull form and such like, but that's effectively what they want to do. The United States does have concerns about battlecruisers. I mean, they've got to think about, well, the Japanese looking for battlecruisers and eventually ordering some. They've also got to think about the fact they've got a fairly large oceanic interest, and potentially they might need to look at mopping up raiding enemy cruisers and such like. Plus, they're also looking out for their own neutral rights, and a battlecruiser is relatively good at enforcing those if push comes to shove, as opposed to committing something from your strategic reserve, i.e. your battle fleet. So, yeah, the US definitely wants them, but the US, as was pretty much the case perpetually up until post-World War One, post-World War Two even, is not being well funded. They're barely scraping by getting coherent classes of battleships out of the budget that Congress is giving them. They're completely missing out on practically any cruiser and destroyer construction at the time, and battlecruisers are expensive. They're more expensive than battleships because of the massive size of the hulls and the amount of power you need to put in them, and etc. and so forth. And so the chances of the US Navy being willing to accept a single battlecruiser for a given year's construction instead of at least a pair of battleships, it's not going to happen. This is why the battlecruiser concept only really comes to a fore when the US has enough money to actually afford to build a proper fleet, i.e. battleships and cruisers, and battlecruisers and destroyers. Matt Kidd asks, which was the most powerful pirate ship from the golden age of piracy? The answer here is going to vary greatly on exactly how you define pirate, because some people will define privateers as pirates, at which point some privateers went out with vessels that either were or might as well have been full-on warships, and so obviously one of those would take the cake. Then you've also got the situation where you have people just going flat out in actual warships, but for whatever reason the other side doesn't recognise them and would like to accuse them of being pirates. So going sort of towards the earlier part of the Age of Sail, people like Francis Drake were often called pirates, and in some circumstances you might make a legitimate or semi-legitimate argument in favour of that point of view, but at other points he was very definitely what I guess you would call a privateer rather than a pirate. So, though that's another great area. The other point is that if you're looking for most powerful pirate vessel, in absolute terms, might be incredibly different to period terms, because you could have a pirate vessel that was the most powerful ship in its area, but might not hold a candle to a warship, or pirate vessels from other periods, like 20, 30 years later. But in that particular vicinity, it was untouchable. You might also have pirate vessels that you compare one for, let's say, from the early 1700s to one from the later 1700s, and the one from the later 1700s might be larger and have more and heavier guns, but compared to warships of that period, it actually might be less powerful than an earlier vessel that may be slightly smaller and slightly less well armed, but proportional to its contemporaries is actually more heavily protected and better armed. And one final thing you've got to bear in mind is that just because a ship carries guns does not necessarily make it more powerful than a ship that has fewer. Quite a lot of pirate ships were armed with quite a number of guns. For example, Queen Anne's Revenge is famous for being very heavily armed, but its guns are relatively light as compared to even a frigate's 18-pounders, for example. But with all that said, if I had to pick a single pirate vessel from the sort of approximate golden age of piracy and put that as the most powerful pirate ship, it would probably have to be the Fancy. It was originally a privateer, and then it became a pirate vessel captained by Henry Every, and it's credited with somewhere around 45 to 50 guns, depending on your source. Some go a little bit higher, some go a fraction lower. But still, even if that involves only carrying lightweight sort of 6 and 9 and maybe a 12-pounder, it's still a lot of guns. A massively larger number of guns than almost any other pirate ship you can come across. And the fact that it seemed to be able to take on some pretty powerful actual proper warships means that some of these guns were probably actually relatively heavy pieces. So yeah, individually most powerful pirate ship, I would give to the Fancy. Swee420 Den asks, what do you think caused the second explosion on board RMS Lusitania? So this is always one of those controversial things. The thing is, Lusitania was known to have been carrying small arms ammunition, .303 rifle ammo, etc., as well as small caliber artillery, sort of 75, 76mm artillery shells, and percussion fuses. But weirdly enough, given the rules and regulations of the 1910s, this was not counted as sort of illegal for a civilian ship to take and expect the protections of a civilian ship. This was effectively chaff in the great scheme of wartime munitions. And so, as I say, although to you and me it might seem a bit absurd to say that the Lusitania was an unarmed merchant vessel that should have been stopped rather than sunk arbitrarily and without warning, I say by the laws of the period, apparently this is the case. So there you go. Anyway, what is known is that she was hit by a torpedo, and then at some point shortly thereafter, there was a secondary quite heavy explosion that would result in the ship going down relatively quickly in sort of about 18-20 minutes or so. What the cause of that secondary explosion is has always been a controversy. There are various claims put around about the ship carrying aluminium powder and or gun cotton, depending on which particular claim you look at. And the idea is effectively that these contributed to the secondary explosion, and this is what put the ship down. Other theories have been advanced, retracted, and research has been done in the wreck. Now, personally, I don't think she was carrying gun cotton or aluminium powder, or if she was, and let's face it, until someone digs up the wreck, completely, which isn't going to happen because it's a protected site now. But if someone forensically took apart the wreck, I suppose in theory you might be able to find aluminium powder if it's still in its casings. Gun cotton probably will have long ago degraded, but never mind. But either way, I rather doubt that she was actually carrying that. For one thing, the amount in question, when they're talking about sort of tens of tons, so often cite figure about 40 to 50 tons of aluminium powder, that doesn't make sense, because if you're trying to transport those kinds of high explosive, or I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful figures quoted, anything from 20 to 30 to 120 tons of gun cotton, but even so, if you're transporting high explosives, you transport them in large amounts. Those kind of amounts, yeah, okay, fair enough. Several tens of tons of high explosive is a lot of bang, but compared to what you can fit on the average cargo ship, it's practically nothing. So why would you bother risking and endangering something as big and as precious as the Lusitania for what's effectively a trivial amount of high explosive cargo? That much doesn't make sense. And also, this is the thing, it falls into that weird little gap between being practical and being plausible. Because a very small amount that's maybe stuffed into a corner somewhere, just in the hopes of rounding out a shipment, is plausible, and it would have been practical in terms of the amount of damage that such an explosion could have caused, which might have contributed to the ship going down. But if you look at the numbers that are suggested, as I say, so even discarding the gun cotton has a separate issue of the fact it's a very sensitive explosive that if the torpedo was going to set it off, it would have set it off pretty much there and then rather than sometime after the impact. But never mind. With the aluminium powder, which is the one that's more commonly claimed, if we go with, let's say, take an average 45 tons, which is roughly kind of the average of the various claims to get thrown around, 45 tons of high-grade explosive aluminium powder, if that gets set off, I mean, okay, it's not quite on the same order of scale as a battleship's magazines, but it's actually well within the scale of something like a cruiser's magazines. If there was 40, and the Lusitania, yeah, it's an ocean liner, it's not a warship, it's nowhere near that heavily built. If 45, 46 or whatever tons of aluminium powder had gone off, and an indeterminate similar or greater amount of gun cotton, or even a large percentage of that had detonated, that ship would not have stayed afloat for 18 to 20 minutes. That would have blown the ship in two, near enough as makes no difference, and it would have been gone within seconds, if not minutes. I mean, we know what happens when large quantities of explosive detonate in something like a warship. We see with Hood, Queen Mary, Inflexible, Invincible, Defense, Indefatigable, not Inflexible, and various other ships, Arizona, Mutsu. If you detonate a larger quantity of explosives low down in a ship, that ship's gone just like that, pretty much. It's almost beyond the realms of plausibility that you could detonate 40 plus tons of high explosive in something like an ocean liner and it still be afloat more than a quarter of an hour later. So yeah, I don't rate that as a plausible explanation for the secondary explosion. In terms of what it could be, I would probably be looking at something like maybe not necessarily a boiler explosion, but something of that vicinity, a steam explosion of some sort, whether it's boilers, engines, steam pipes, steam plants, something like that. I mean, where the torpedo hit, it's entirely possible that could have, well, it did obviously breach some of the engine rooms because it caused flooding, but it's possible that the shock of the explosion could have unseated, bent, blocked, or otherwise impeded something which built up pressure and then blew, and that would have caused an explosive type event that would have been very registrable and would have accelerated the sinking of the ship because it would have blown out bulkheads, opened up further parts of the ship to flooding, but it also allows for the ship to go down relatively intact. as to exactly what caused that explosion, well, say, unless and until someone develops a pocket-sized underwater remote vehicle that can penetrate into the forward engine compartments and have a look around and examine it for signs of what may or may not have happened internally, we're probably not going to be able to pin down exactly what it was. But dozens of tons of high explosive, it almost certainly wasn't. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Next week we'll see Drydock episode 100, so we'll see how that all pans out and what I'm going to do for that. And the other thing is, for those of you who've kept an eye on the community posts on the YouTube channel, you will know that earlier in the week there were some major problems with my PC. It had just basically gone into a constant loop of blue screens of death with all sorts of weird and wonderful error codes. I did, after some time worrying as to whether or not I'd be able to render Wednesday's video on Admiral Nelson, I did manage to kind of patch it back together again using an off-board Windows repair, as it seems there were all sorts of corruption issues with the base Windows files. But I was also worried that there may be damage or issues with the core hardware, the motherboard, the CPU, etc. And by the time I managed to patch it back into shape, I'd already gone and ordered a bunch of upgrade parts, and they're already on their way, so waste not, want not. And I spent Thursday evening building this new PC, cannibalizing some of the parts of the old PC. I may have made a small mistake with the choice of case. I wanted a nice big tower case. I mean, not that my other previous tower case was small, but I want something with just a little bit more wiggle room. And yeah, I accidentally ended up with something that looks suspiciously like a cross between the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey and maybe something from the Necrontyr Empire. So yeah, if you suddenly hear Gauss beams flaying and screaming and "Sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that" in a horrible mashup of various sci-fi franchises, you'll know that something's gone terribly wrong. But for the minute, it seems to be running very nice and calmly. And well, rendering this video will be the first test of whether or not there's any improvement in rendering times. So we'll see how that goes. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all the other channel admin there is for the minute. Hopefully I will be heading down to Portsmouth Historic Dockyard in the next few weeks to try and grab some film footage from some of the museums there. Just waiting to hear back on an email chain. I'm corresponding with the Mary Rose Museum at the minute. And well, I sent another speculative email to the Chatham Dockyard as well, so we'll see how that goes. And I've still got to find the time to head out to SS Great Britain and the Golden Hind, who have responded to me, but I haven't had the time to actually physically go out there and do the filming. So minor spoilers into various upcoming Wednesday episodes, and I'll leave it there. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.